Instructed to turn that on. All right. I want people to hear me in the back, but I don't want to be yelling. So is this a comfortable volume? Thumbs up. Awesome. Great. A lot of you are awake still. That's awesome. All right. Hopefully you're in the right room. If not, well, there's a door, or you can keep yourself occupied with whatever you want there. This talk is Secure, Performant, Scalable, and Green, the big wins of a static Drupal site. That's a bit of a mouthful. I am going to try to make this a little more interactive so that we keep people awake. And so if you don't want to be called upon, I won't point at people, but just keep in mind I might be asking some questions along the way. All right. My name is Kristen. I am a co-founder at Quant CDN. And here's some ways of getting hold of me. If you're on Drupal Slack, feel free to DM me. I'm all about community, and in this talk I'll be focused on sort of static and that sort of side of things, but I'm also about design systems and about contribution, mentoring, all sorts of fun stuff. So I mentioned it earlier for people who were here a little bit early, but there is a mentored contribution that's happening tomorrow, and I'm going to be one of the mentors there. So I encourage everyone who's interested in doing contribution. You don't have to have ever done it before. You do not have to be a coder. All skill sets, all levels. Please come out. It'll be a lot of fun. All right, a little bit about Quant. We have a bunch of services, CDN, WAF, static hosting, static failover, all sorts of fun stuff. So if this, this kind of stuff is something you're interested in, please, ping me after this, or, hit me up on, email or Slack or anything. All right, so I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. So who here would call themselves a developer, engineer? Oh, wow. All right. Good chunk of you. All right. How about more on the front end side, maybe more theming? Okay, handful. Nice. And then project manager, strategist, content business owner. Okay, got a few. How many of you do everything, all the things rolled in together? Yeah, there's a good number of you there. Okay, so we're all on the same page. And then how about government sites? Are people working in government at all? Handful. Nonprofits, maybe? Oh, yeah, good number. Enterprise. Oh, not too much, actually. Education. Ah, okay, got a mix here. Nice, okay. So I've done all those things, basically all the hats and all the verticals and all that fun stuff. So feel free to pick my brain about this or other things or whatever. I've been doing Drupal since 2004. So if you were in that, in the Dries note, when they said to stay up if it was 20 years or more, I just had my 20-year anniversary just a few weeks ago. So it's been a while, thank you very much. And it's been fun. I love the Drupal community, it's awesome. This was literally the first Dries note that I watched where I was surprised. So I don't know who else was like, whoa, that's pretty cool, the Starshot thing. So been around for a long time, usually Dries note, hear about this and that, and they're all lots of cool initiatives and stuff, but that one was definitely turned my head a little bit. All right, some disclaimers. I do work at Quant. There will be some things in there that we provide. It's not meant to be a sales pitch, but always feel free to contact me if you're interested. But I will also have logo walls of competitors and things, so I'm trying to keep it fair. The other disclaimer is I do have products and services. I haven't used every single thing that I'm going to show in here, so if you're going to ask me some intricacies of one of the different services that I'm listing doesn't mean I know how to use it right. So, so just some disclaimers out of the way. Okay, so we're going to give kind of a high-level overview of why you would want to use stat, kind of what it is and why would you want to use it. Some of the pieces of the puzzle, the different technologies that you might be using if you're doing a static website, and sort of how you might put those together. And then we'll focus specifically on how you can approach static with Drupal itself, since we are at DrupalCon. A lot of these approaches extend beyond Drupal. So if you're doing WordPress sites or other things, a lot of this stuff still applies. And we should have time for questions. And then this deck does have some resources at the end. I'll make sure the slides are available on the DrupalCon website, and then you'll be able to look at those as well. And normally we do save questions for the end, but if you have something that's highly relevant to what we're talking about, right, on a particular slide, just raise your hand, and I can repeat the question, and we can address it there. All right, so why static? Well, back up. What is static? So who here has actually used a static website? Ah, a lot of you. Awesome. Okay. How about, so you've used one, have you built it? Like, how many of you have actually built a static web? Okay, so a little bit less, but it's a good number of you. So, so the deal with static, right, it's kind of going back to, I don't know how many have been around for a while. I have in the web, right, back to the 90s, where, basically you just had, yeah, who here has built a site in the 90s? All right, my people, awesome. So yeah, you just basically you had your HTML, these days CSS, JavaScript, and your images and your files, and that was your site. You didn't have a database, you didn't have all this fancy stuff, you didn't have a CMS, all those things, right? So static website or static web page is just basically those static assets, those files, and that is your whole thing. You do not have a back end. So some good use cases for static. First example here is a static archive. So who here's used Wayback Machine? Yeah, okay, so quite a few of you, right? You're like, oh shoot, I don't remember I've used it actually on Drupal.org. I was trying to see some stats on a profile page, and I was like, oh shoot, I didn't collect it, last month, and I went, and I'm like, oh good, it crawled it, and I could go grab that information. So static archive, it just basically has these snapshots of a website in some point in time. You can use that if you want to archive, basically, you're done with the site. You're not making any more changes anymore. You're done. You put it out there. It's still available for people, but you're not going to do any more development on it, for example. Disaster recovery is another one, which you may or may not be as familiar with. Has anyone used static for failover, for disaster recovery? Oh, okay, cool. Actually, yeah, a handful of people. So the idea there, so disaster recovery, that's a whole talk on its own. I gave a talk on that for Stanford a few days ago. But you want to be able to fail over to something. So one approach is you fail over to a static site because, okay, maybe you have a fancy site, there's a lot of stuff going on, but you want to be able to fail over if something's going on with your back end, right? So it just gives you kind of a parallel site that you can flip over to if you need to. Another thing is revision history. So we work a lot with government websites, and they actually have to have a whole revision history for every change they've made on their websites. A lot of times it's actually something that they have to do for compliance. So if, maybe a higher ed site might require this, or a government website where they have to have that trail so that people can go and see what happened in the past. And then probably a more common thing that people hear about, especially at DrupalCons, is your static front end. Woohoo, right? So you can have your React and your Vue.js and all these fun, shiny things, and Gatsby and all that fun stuff. So who here has worked with a JavaScript front end in this sort of, so like React, Vue, that kind of thing? Okay, a good chunk of people. Awesome. So this talk is not about those, right? Because we've had a lot of talks about those, and that's sort of been done, and I think it's, it's a great tool, awesome, but our focus really is about, I don't want to redo my front end. I don't want to use React or any, I just want to use my theme, and I want to just be able to go static, right? So that's kind of more of the focus of this talk. All right, story time. Does anybody want to say a site they used that was static, that was kind of fun or problematic or fun or different, or anybody want to share anything? Put you on the spot. I told you I was going to. All right, nobody. That's okay. So I'll give you a couple examples. So just a simple example. Our personal company website uses Drupal 10, right? But our site is pretty static. Like, there's not a lot of dynamic information on it. Why do we need to serve it up with Drupal? Because then we got the backend and the database and the CMS and all that fun stuff, right? And when we don't really need it. So we don't do that, right? We have a static version of our site, and that's what we use. A more interesting example is one where it was more of a decoupled site. This was for an Australian government client, and they had Vue.js they were using with components. So they had these, front-end components. They wanted to be able to let their content editors mix and match and do like these landing pages, right? Sort of a pretty common pattern that we see using kind of these content components. But again, at the end of the day, even though they want their content editors to do all that, at the end of the day, the site wasn't really dynamic itself. So they wanted that aspect for the content editors, but they didn't really need anything fancy for the end user, because it was basically a brochure. Sometimes people say brochureware, right? It's just a pretty simple site. There's not a lot of interactive components, right? So those are a couple examples, and I've worked on others, but. All right, some pros and cons. And you have to take anytime people give you pros and cons, you have to take it all with a grain of salt, right? Because it might be a pro in one situation and becomes a con in another situation, depending on your use case, right? But generally speaking, so one of the cons of having a static site is that it's static, right? Because if your site is super dynamic and has to go and grab stuff from the database and do all this fun stuff, and it's some weird game that's saving data and stats and all this fun stuff, well, okay, obviously not a good use case for that, right? But if you are more of a brochureware, kind of, there's not a lot of dynamic functionality. You can still have JavaScript, that's fine. So you could have interactive stuff in JavaScript, so client side, no problem, you still have that, but you're not going to be talking back to the database. So that static aspect, in some sites, it's just not going to make sense, right? And then on the pros, there's a lot of stuff, and I'll go in a little bit more detail, but you can see them here, right? Performance, security, scalability as a result of these things. And let me just go through a little more detail. So why are they more secure? There's nothing to hack, right? It's just some markup, some image file. Like, there's no back end, right? There's just nothing for the hackers to go and hack. So, and then you just don't have that dependency chain, right? When you have Drupal and you've got third-party you could still have the JavaScript, marketing site, plugins and all that, that kind of stuff. But in general, you don't have that whole stack that you have to worry about, all the different security patches and things that come along with that. And it's sort of the similar reason why it's faster, right? You don't have that back end. You don't have the database queries that are bogging it down, or that server-side processing. And you can usually do simpler caching. You can use a CDN. So all of a sudden, you have these files. You can send them all over the world, right? And those files can then, you grab them for whatever the closest location, and then your users are getting the fastest possible experience. And because of those things, then it scales better. You're on the front page of the New York Times, and no problem. You've got your assets all over the world because it's, there's no database or any of that stuff, and people are able to get at that information faster, and therefore you can scale much better with a static site. And because of that, now it doesn't mean that you don't have a backend. You can still have a backend. You can have one where you're just doing Markdown or whatever. You don't have to use Drupal or a CMS. But if you do have a backend, you would still have that. You would still have web hosting for that. But that would be locked down to the people that needed access, right? So that would be your content editors, that would be your developers. So that footprint of that back end can be, pretty small, right? And then that static aspect, that CDN, pushing it out to around the world, it's usually pretty cheap. So you can often balance your costs instead of having, a really expensive hosting bill, kind of shift that around if you don't have a lot of dynamic content. Well, I just talked about that. So yeah, that basically ends up making it cheaper. All right, so here are some situations where static can make a lot of sense. You got people around the world using your website, You don't have to go static for that. You can still use a CDN and use that for, your static assets, your images, and but having a static site, then you can actually push the HTML around the world too, instead of just the images. And then what we talked about, right, is that minimal dynamic functionality. You don't have to have no dynamic functionality. And actually, some things you can have dynamic that's still more of a third-party plugin, like forms, right? There's these services you can use. I mean, obviously, web forms is amazing, and I love web forms. But if you wanted to use some third-party service to do your web, your forms on your site, that would just be a JavaScript, call from in your code, in your page. You wouldn't need a backend for that, right? That's using someone else's service. Now that could potentially, have some performance impact on that particular form page or whatever. So, again, that's where it's like, take all of this with a little bit of grain of salt. But, or search for another example, right? You could still have a dynamic search on your site, but then maybe you're using a third-party service, Algolia or something, in order to do that. So you don't have to necessarily sacrifice some of those essential dynamic features that every website has if you're going static. For security, so I work a lot with government websites, like I mentioned, and government websites, you have to hit some certain compliance standards and all that, and they go through these audits and vulnerability testing and all this fun stuff, right? So this is a pretty easy way to pass with flying colors, right? Because there's nothing to hack, so of course I'm gonna pass my tests. I'm gonna pass my security compliance with a static site. And then the last one's just about reducing that carbon footprint. So, we all want to try to be a little nicer to the planet, less resources, less emissions, and hopefully, we keep that in check. All right, so that's some pros and cons. And again, feel free if people have questions in the middle. I can repeat the question, and no problem. Okay, so hopefully you've sort of drank the Kool-Aid a little bit. You think, okay, yeah, this is good stuff. Like, I can see using this, or at least maybe not in every situation, but it can be useful, and I'm on board. Okay, so well now what? Like, what do I do? So here are some technologies. The idea with static is you have to have, so this is just generally, not specifically Drupal, but you need some sort of source of content. It can be a markdown file. So there are static systems where people write markdown, and that's their content, that's their blog post, and that's what they use. And then there's kind of two approaches. So you have a content source that you're working with, and you can either crawl that site. So say it's a Drupal site, right? I have my Drupal site. Well, I can either externally grab the content from that and make it static. That's one approach, which is scrapers, crawlers. Or the other approach is I work within, and I use a static site generator within the system and generate my static content. And then in both of those cases, ultimately, I need to put it somewhere, right? I need to host it. And so we'll talk about some options here for all of these different things. So with content sources, like I said, some people will you'll have a personal blog post, write it in Markdown, easy peasy. We've got a lot of developers in the house, so I wouldn't be surprised. Anyone writing Markdown and pushing it out to a static site like GitHub Pages or something, oh yeah, there we go. Wait, several of you. Okay, awesome. And then all the way to, CMS, Drupal, grabbing stuff from the database, using the APIs, JSON API, whatever, right? So you can get your content from all sorts of places. And then the kind of crawler aspect, I'm sure we had so many developers and, okay, wget, probably some of you have used several of these tools, I would guess, just sort of command line tools. Who here has used, Simple Crawler, wget, or one of these tools to crawl a site? Yeah, okay. A good half of the room, right? So there's kind of two different ways you can have a crawler. One is, one of these command line tools, developer tools that you use that a lot of people here have used. And another approach is to use more of a software as a service, right? A SaaS crawler. And the, advantage of doing a, command line is, especially with this crowd, I mean, you know it, you've done it, it's easy. You know what flags to put in and stuff to do what you want to do. But not everyone's a developer, even though most of us here are. So having some sort of crawler that you can use through the UI can be useful for some, right? So having some sort of software as a service, you log in, you point it at the website and say, I want to crawl this site. When I did some research, so Quant has a crawler, but the only other thing I could find really that was more of that kind of click through the UI was something from Zeit, Scrapy probably, Scrapy Cloud. I haven't used it. Maybe it's good, I don't know. So, but if you happen to know, so that's another thing, if you see something here like, oh, I know something that works, feel free to ping me afterwards and can always update the slides and get more of this out to people. The other side of things, and some of these names you're going to know because some people have already worked with them, right? Your Gatsby's and your Next and Nuxt and all that fun stuff, right? So, so several of these are more of your traditional Jamstack, JavaScript, front end that has a static aspect, right? And there's been plenty of talks on that. So again, we're not going to go into detail on that, but. There are a couple here, Hugo, Jekyll, Hexo. Those are a little bit more, so like Go, which is obviously a different language than what most people, some people probably have done Go in here, but, Jekyll or Hexo, you might be doing Markdown. Then on the far right, the last two are a little bit more, in this case, Drupal-centric. And we'll go a little bit more into those, but so, Quant has a module, Tome. Who here has heard of Tome in the static? Oh, okay, actually less than I expected. All right, so a handful of you. So we'll go a little bit over Tome in just a little bit, because that is definitely more of a Drupal-centric solution. So highlighted here are the ones that have some sort of Drupal integration. Whether just a module or some of these a little bit more full-featured integration that you might want to check out if you're exploring this space. And well, to back up a little bit, so the GitHub stars, so the numbers here, not the Drupal-specific ones, but you'll see kind of popularity with the GitHub stars. Next is quite popular, and then it, ramps down a little bit. But, they're all pretty up there, right? Pretty popular among developers around the world. And then, who here's used Built With to check stats? Oh, yeah, so a few of you, not a whole lot. And it's pretty handy. It's kind of a fun place if you're like, well, I heard of some weird technology. I have no idea what they're talking about. Is this popular or not, right? You can go and just throw it in there, and it'll tell you, roughly how many sites in the world it thinks are using that particular technology. So, the tracking with GitHub stars was actually not too bad. It was kind of similar, but you see, yeah, Next is the most popular of the bunch there. All right, so you have your content source of some sort, and you've decided you're going to crawl or you're going to do a static site generator. You got to put this stuff somewhere, right? And like a lot of things, there's so many options. So who here rolls around, they've got their Linode, their DigitalOcean, all that fun stuff? Yeah, there's a few of you. I try not to do that so much anymore, but back in the day, I did a lot of that. And then there's some that are a little more specialized, right? Your GitHub pages, GitLab pages, Cloudflare pages, kind of, pretty specialized. Like this, the whole point is to do this kind of static hosting. And I think some of you have been using those as well, I think. Hands up. Yep, so a handful of you as well. And then, of course, there's the, behemoth S3, right? Probably most of you, even if you haven't done static hosting, you've probably done something with S3 at some point in your life, whether you wanted to or not. And, a very myriad of other things. Now, on the lower, on the bottom, besides DigitalOcean and Linode, then we get in kind of little more bells and whistles. So kind of top, that's a little more of your bare bones static hosting options. And there's going to be other options that aren't, I run out of, that's a lot of things, right? I run out of space. But on the bottom, you're going to get more options, right? CDNs and WAFs and, SLAs, uptime and all this fun stuff, right? So if you need more than just throwing some files up on S3 and calling it a day, then you have other options available to you as well. And then highlighted on that end, we have several with Drupal modules available to you in order to make that integration a little bit easier. And again, I work at Quant, but I'm trying to be fair here, and have the competitors as well. So do your due diligence and explore what options might work for you. Okay, I'll quickly talk about site architecture, and this is super high level. So we're not going to do any, nitty-gritty architecture diagrams or anything. This is like very, very, very high level. Very high level. All right, so let's assume we have a Drupal site. We're going to still have our Drupal hosting, right? That's on the far left. So our source website, in this case Drupal, and that's still going to be hosted somewhere. If you have a fully static site, meaning you don't have any functionality you really need to go back to the database for, or the backend system, you can actually lock down that backend site. Right? You can put it behind a firewall, basic auth, and say, okay, that's for my developers, that's for my content editors. I don't need the outside world hitting it, and that gives you that security. You're just going to hide it, lock it down. Nobody knows about it except for the people that need to know about it. And then at that point, you say, okay, do I want to crawl it and make my static pages, or do I want to use a more internal tool, a static site generator, to make those static pages? And we'll talk some pros and cons in a bit. And then, yeah, you get those files to the static hosting and off to your end user. So that's the top scenario, very simple, straightforward. The partially static is something that actually we do a lot, because there may still be some pages that can't be static. There is stuff going on there, maybe more advanced forms or some sort of interactive widget where they're going back to the database and doing some fun stuff. And so you don't want to tie people's hands and say, well, no, you can't have any dynamic functionality on your site. You want a way to be able to let them still have those few pages that are more interactive. And this is one way of doing it. You just basically, you have a hybrid. And you can do this with a CDN, where you basically proxy or route back those particular URLs with those dynamic features. You route them back to origin or the source website. So, so that's the thing about static. It's not like an all or nothing thing. You can have the best of both worlds. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of having a crawler. Let's do a time check. Yeah, we're good. One pro is just, it's pretty simple, right? You just point it at your website, crawl it, all good. You don't normally need backend access. Sometimes it can make things more efficient if you do have backend access, depending on what kind of stuff it's crawling, like if you had some hidden pages that you needed to get. But the downside is if there is a change on your website, you need to recrawl, right? Because unless you're, maybe you're keeping track of which pages are changing when and then only crawling those particular pages, but this can be a little bit manual and a bit more intensive, or you'll have to do some DevOps and do some, some smart scripts that are keeping track of things, and it can be, a little bit more maintenance on that end. Most of the options, at least that I've seen, are mostly command line, right? So if you're not really a developer and you want to be able to just, put this in someone else's hands who's, technical but maybe not so hands-on, then it may be a little bit trickier to do. And then most of the solutions that I found did not integrate directly with the hosting environment. Okay, and then we'll talk a little bit about pros and cons for static site generator. Usually a little more complex to set up than just a crawler where you're just like, here's a URL, have at it, have fun, crawl my thing. They do need backend access. But one of the upsides is generally with static site generators, you can do what's called an incremental push or an incremental, a dump of the pages that have changed. And the problem is if you have a website that's got, I don't know, 100,000 pages, I mean, I've had sites that have been, of that order, right? You're not going to crawl that whole site every single time there's a change, and you don't want to have to regenerate all your static pages. A few pages changed, and then you have to, regenerate your whole site. That's no fun, right? So what you're going to want to do is make sure that you're looking for a system that lets you do incrementals, so that when there is a change, only those things that have changed are actually what are getting regenerated to static. And then there are quite a few that have options to just go straight into hosting, and we'll see some in a bit. All right, our beloved Drupal. Anyone here not using Drupal generally? Are we all Drupal people? Any not Drupal? It's okay, it's a safe space. All right, no, okay, awesome. Yeah, so I mean, again, this is focused on Drupal, but these principles apply to other, WordPress and all our friendlies out in the open source world. So all good. All right, so we've got our friendly Drupal guy who's got his running shoes. He's going to go fast with his performance, looking cool with his shades, got his security going on. So I mentioned before that you can use APIs and these kind of specialized integrations. I'm not going to talk about those. I think a year or two I did have a talk that talked a little bit more about those, but for this one, we're going to focus on that kind of crawling and then also pushing static content from within Drupal out to a hosting environment. This slide should look familiar. We've already seen this slide. So one approach is, yeah, like we said, we can do that crawling and get our static content. And then the other one, okay, so if you were doing a crawling, if you were a command line person, you might see some, terminal-y stuff and whatever, right? So most people here have seen this kind of stuff, so nothing new there. If you were using more of a software as a service for a crawler, you might, you're going into a browser, you're logging in, you're pointing to a website. You might need to do some authentication keys to make it go faster so that it's not having to just chunk them out, a few hundred pages at a time to make sure that, because you don't want someone crawling your site that's not really supposed to be crawling your site, so there are some mitigations in place often with these services, right, that say, no, this really is my site, right? Just like Google Analytics or any of these things where you could put basically a key and says, yes, this is my site, I am the site owner. And then, yeah, another benefit of using something like this is you can have it on a schedule. Maybe you don't update your website that much. Maybe you update it once a week or once a month, it's mostly static already, and you can have it just crawl once a week, once a month, and then you don't have, it's a simple approach, and you don't have to worry about doing static site generator or any of that stuff. Okay, so on the syncing side, so basically, you say you have a 100,000 page website. You need to get all of that over to your hosting initially, right? Then ideally, when things change, you're just getting that incremental. But with the crawler, like we said, it can be a little more challenging, right? It doesn't know necessarily what has changed, what hasn't changed. Sometimes with software as a service, it might be able to be smart about it and look at MD5 hashes or fun stuff and say, oh yeah, no, this page has changed, this page hasn't changed. But if you're doing that local crawling, then just something to keep in mind that you might have to just crawl everything and re-upload. With the SaaS solutions, ideally it's also part of a hosting, so then you don't have to then go and upload it from there. And then within Drupal, there were a handful of people that had used Tome, and that's the most popular sort of static sort of solution. When you talk to people in the Drupal space about, oh, have you done static, or what have you used? Usually the answer is Tome. So Tome is a Drupal module, and so it basically just will dump out a static version of your site. So it knows all Drupal things, and it works great. And then there's all these submodules. Well, they're their own projects, so they're not really submodules, but they are sort of part of the ecosystem, the Tome ecosystem, where, okay, you're like, okay, I want to use Tome, and I want to get this S3. Well, there's a module for that, right? It's Drupal. Of course there's a module for that. Okay, I want to get it over to GitHub Pages. Yeah, there's a module for that. So, and Netlify is another one, right? So what you can do is it's basically a two-step process. You generate the static, and then you use one of these additional modules where you're pushing it over to whichever static hosting provider that you want to use. Now, there are some other players in this space. So there is Quant. That one, it's self-contained. You just connect it to Quant, and we'll see an example in a sec. And you don't need, additional modules in the ecosystem. And then, but there were a couple others that I saw in the Drupal in D.O, which was Static Site Generator and Static Suite. So I'm curious, anyone used either of these last two options? Because I'm less familiar with them. I found them. They do seem to have some usage. Nope, okay. Yeah, so I can't, the last one, Static Suite, it said under development, so I'm not even sure how, it might be super alpha, haven't played too much with that. My homework is I should probably try these a little bit more to see what's going on. But Static Site Generator, I believe, has been around for a little bit longer. But one thing to note, at least from what I could tell, the Static Site Generator didn't really have that kind of hook into hosting like the Tome ecosystem did. So so I might have missed something, didn't read all the docs. But anyway, at least there's some places for you to explore if you're interested in making your Drupal website static. All right, so just a quick example. If you wanted to use Quant, you create a Quant account, you enable this module that's from Drupal.org. It'll give you an API key. And then we just have this idea of seeding, where basically that's your big push, right? You're going to seed your whole site. If it's 1,000 pages, 10,000 pages, might take some time if it's a lot of pages, but you can run this with Drush. Lots of developers in the house, so no problem there. So you seed it, which basically just puts a bunch of stuff in the queue, and then you process that queue, and it just pushes stuff over in batches. And then on the Quant side, you can see it, and once you decide it's all good, you can say, yeah, awesome, I'm gonna make this live, and you're good to go. I did play around with Tome and Netlify, because those are popular things that people also use. It's pretty simple. It was a little bit more work, and there was a couple steps where I'm like, what am I supposed to do? But like what I did is I made a fake site in Netlify, just a hello world HTML index to HTML page, because I wasn't sure how else to make a site without just a fake one. And then I used that and basically overrode it when I pushed out my static site to that. So it is a few more steps. I think that part wasn't super annoying, but I think towards the end when you have these, deploys, and then you look at it, but then you have to publish the deploy, and then you get another one, you have to publish that, and I don't know. I'm not in that ecosystem that much, so maybe I'm missing some shortcut. I'm happy to be corrected in the Q&A if we have time. But yeah, I did find it a little bit more cumbersome. So if you've had better luck with this workflow, happy to hear from you. Okay, so in that situation, we talked about the incrementals, right? You do your big push, and then you want to do these incremental changes when content changes. So out of the box, Quant will just, you edit a page, it'll just push that over, right? You don't have to think about it. You can turn that off if for some reason you don't want that to happen, but out of the box, it'll just push it over for you. Change a page, change the taxonomy term, so that page changes, it'll push it over. Again, with the Tome Netlify, for me, it was a little more cumbersome. I had to get the sync over there and then publish and publish. That workflow is not going to work with content editors or non-technical people. So probably you could, unless I'm missing a checkbox somewhere or something, you could probably set up some sort of automation on the back end with some DevOps and all that. Developers are mostly in the house, right? But yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong. If there's an easier way, awesome. Let's hear about it. But I did find it a little bit more labor intensive to get those changes to come through. And I think most people were probably at the Dries node, or at least have heard about this whole Starshot thing. So it got me thinking, I don't know, some sort of static thing make people think about Drupal differently, want to use Drupal? I don't know. It was just a question I had in my head. Simple site that's up on whatever, Linode or Netlify or Quant or whatever, right? Is that attractive? I don't know. This is more of an open-ended question. I'm happy to hear feedback on that. And yep, we still have a couple minutes left. So with that, I will open it up for any questions. All right.
Thinking about partial static, with the solutions, either Quant or Tome, can you use those, or is it an all or nothing?
Oh, so the question is with if you have a partially static site and you want to have some dynamic routes, are you like having some vendor lock-in, or are you stuck with one solution versus another? Is that the question, or? Yeah, views filtering.
JavaScript, I guess, or Ajax, but
yeah.
And then, can the solutions use it? A, if they can use in a partially static environment, and then B, is there criteria that you can specify, either say like all of these content types generate static, or age? Those would be like two examples, and I'm thinking of that I would want to make these types of pages static.
Yeah, so depending on the solution, it can be pretty granular. You can literally say specific routes, only these pages are static, or these pages aren't static. And like views is a perfect example, right? You have a views page. Sometimes it is going back to the database and grabbing stuff. So that's actually a perfect example. And I've done them both ways. One approach is if you just have a certain number of filters, and maybe they're just like, you click and you get something that it's not a huge data set. You could actually crawl each of the things if it's a more self-contained view with a limited number of pages and results. You could actually crawl all of them and then have all of those static, and so then it's super fast. Or you could just say, no, I don't want any of my views pages to be static, or I only want some of them. So it can be pretty granular. So it really depends on the solution that you choose, but there is some flexibility to pick and choose and say what you want to be granular, to be static or not, and routing things back.
And I think you said the keyword routes, so I can say like,
yeah.
this pattern.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so you can, yeah, so with route, just like with Drupal, right, when you do the star and you say, I want anything under this particular, slash, blog, slash, maybe you don't want any of your blog pages static for some reason, you can say, no, I ignore those and keep those out, or no, I do want all those, but I don't really want any of the other stuff. Yeah. All right.
So I don't know if you can answer this very accurately because every site's different, but if I were wanting to sell this idea to management,
Mm-hmm.
do you have any ballpark estimates on the savings for this?
Yeah, so okay, the question is, if we want to pitch this to our bosses or the stakeholders or the site, the people with the purse strings, the money, how can we say you're going to save X? And that is the $1 million question, really, because it really is dependent on how big the site is, how static can you make it, what are your hosting choices. So you really can't just say, oh yeah, you're going to save 50%, or you're going to save 100%, well not 100, but whatever, 90% or whatever. You're going to have to look at the solutions, and then with every hosting provider, they have tiers, right? And they say, oh, if you have this many hits and this much bandwidth and all this fun stuff, right? So you're going to have to see, okay, well, if I lock down my back end, I'm only going to have this many users, so now we're down at the low tier, so it's this much, and then, oh, but I have this much traffic. So even on the static side, with the CDNs and all that, you still have traffic limits and tiers and all that, right? So you're going to have to you're going to have to do those estimates and then add up and say, okay, it's going to be the low tier or the medium tier plus the high-end tier, because we have a lot of traffic, but it's mostly static. So unfortunately, yeah, you're probably going to save money, but it's not clear how much you're going to necessarily save. Yeah, go ahead.
A quick follow-up, you might know it. So you're the founder or co-founder for Quant.
Yeah.
What is one or two of your top success stories?
Oh, how much have they saved? Wow, you put me on the spot there. Yeah, I don't have numbers like on the top of my head. I'd have to probably go and ping some of the project teams to see some of the Okay, I owe you some blog posts, I think, with some anonymized numbers in it. But yeah, okay, that's my homework for today. All right.
Hi, yeah, I have a potential client who's considering, they have a need for a static site, and search is kind of our big question, right? So
Yep.
we're okay with pretty much everything else being static, but we need at least basic search. So how does that fit with replacing, like, we have a standard Drupal search API / Elasticsearch implementation?
Right.
And we know it's not going to be the same, but can we get a basic search going using Quant CDN?
Yeah. So the way that usually, so we use Algolia for our search engine, but it's a similar idea with Elastic, right? So when you're generating that static content, you're actually pushing it to your search index. In our case, Algolia. In your case, Elastic, right? And so you can still do the same types of site-wide searching that you would if you were using Elastic or your Solar or those kinds of things.
I think it is, we avoid hitting our own
Yeah.
standard endpoints, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a third-party service. Yeah, it's through Algolia.
Search endpoint that would be hit from the browser.
Yeah, exactly.
We're just trying to avoid, for certain audiences, international basically, not hitting our own Drupal instances.
Yeah, and that's actually a very common use case. So yeah, good point. All right, back.
So for setting a site to be static or not, with the routing set them, can an editor do that, or does it need a developer to define those rules?
Very good question. Right now, it is more of a like a site builder level role rather than a content editor role. But to be honest, I mean, you could probably. So there is an API, or at least I can speak for Quant. There's API, and you could make a custom module that exposes something to your node pages edit form that says, oh, okay, ignore that, leave this one off or whatever. Would you want them to? That's a whole nother question, right? Do you want your content editors to be able to do that? That I think it's probably more of a higher level decision in most cases. It may be a content strategy decision that you work with your content team and try to understand what type of information you're going to be having on those pages, and more of a collaborative thing. But at the end of the day, it may be safer to have it a little more locked down. Even if it was part of the content, the node edit form, maybe you do want it editable. Maybe it's something that's elevated privileges. Maybe only admins can go in and and tweak those if it's a kind of a case-by-case basis. Yeah. Follow up?
I asked because some pages, sometimes editors are going to add web forms to a page.
Oh yeah, sure.
You don't have that visibility on our end as well.
Right.
And so it could be any page on their site.
Yeah.
So if they do that, then they would have to find a way to not make that page static, right?
We do have web form integration. That's a good question. You're adding it to existing, so you're embedding it like as a component within the page, like in an iframe or something like that, or in a component, yeah. Yeah, so we've done that. I haven't done that in a little while. We have done, just sort of your standard web form pages and integrate that way. As far as like embedding it in kind of an iframe within a component on the page. I have done that in the past. I haven't looked at that in a little while, so I'm not 100% sure that'll work out of the box. Maybe that's another homework for me to go and play with that. And anyone that I have homework for, feel free to give me your contact information, and I can try to follow up with you after. All right, another question, yeah.
Yeah, so how does percentage play work? Right? If the content author, they want to see the changes, what they're making in Drupal, the full design.
Yeah.
They can able to see that before publishing ours. It's a static site.
Okay, so the question is, will the content editor be able to see the content that ends up being on the static site? And the answer is yes, because it's exactly the same as what you're seeing in Drupal. So as long as they can see it in Drupal, they edit it and they see it, that's exactly what they're going to see on the static site. So one for one.
So we have to build a theme in Drupal so that the content author can see the full design.
Right.
Also, like a static site also has the same theme, right?
No. So you don't have two themes. It is using the Drupal. So there's no theming or anything on the static site. It's just a snap. Just think of it as like a snapshot of whatever your site looks like. Yeah. So whatever one theme, whatever theme you're using. Then that's why you can kind of mix and match and have some pages that are static and some that aren't. It's seamless because you don't even actually know. You can't tell because it looks the same in both situations. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? I think we're over, but thank you very much. I appreciate the time, and talk to you later.